The next keynote speaker that I would like to introduce is Liz Weaver, and Liz is going to talk to us about the collective impact opportunity. Liz has her Master's of Management for National Volunteer Sector Leaders through McGill University. She leads the Tamarack Learning Center, which works with community leaders to help them become a collective force for social change like we're trying to do here. And Liz has developed curriculum and provided training on a variety of topics such as collective impact, which she'll be talking to us about today, community innovation, leadership, collaborative governance, and influencing policy changes and social media, all very relevant, topics for our efforts. She's also provided coaching and leadership and support to communities across Canada, also Alaska and the lower 48 regarding creating a framework for collaboration and change. So please, let's give a welcome to Liz Weaver.
So good morning, everybody. I'm just going to edge this around so I don't have to bend my neck so much. It's really great to be here. As you may know, I come from Canada, and I feel like you're almost Canadians, right? A couple of other decisions, and you all would have been saying A as much as I do. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to watch the cruise ships come in and out of this community on a regular basis. That's quite intrigued by that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a subject that actually builds very nicely on what we just heard from Elaine this morning. Over the course of the 2 days that we've been together, we've talked about the what, and we've also talked a little bit about the so what. My topic is really going to look at the now what. What can we do together? How can we work collectively to address some of the serious social issues that our communities are facing? And so collective impact is a framework that really provides us with a kind of a shared language, a shared way of thinking about this work, and a shared way of kind of approaching the work to try to really move the needle on issues that are really kind of vexing our communities at this point in time. So, as I was saying, collective impact is this framework for change. Before we go into that too much, I'll tell you a little bit about my organization, which is Tamarack, that Walter referred to it a little bit. At Tamarack, we do work with communities and community leaders, and we really do want to connect people together to the tools and resources that they need to really try to solve these social problems that they're facing. And so we have two areas of practice that we spend a lot of time working in. And the area that I used to work in was around place-based poverty reduction issues. And in Canada, we've been at this work for about 14 years. And the first 10 years, we worked really deeply with 13 communities. This is Tamarack here. We worked very deeply with 13 communities, and now we're scaling up to 50 communities. And one of the lessons that we learned, and Elaine talked about this, the critical engagement of people with the lived experience of poverty. We feel like this work couldn't happen in Canada if we didn't have those voices at the table. And so that's been a really important lesson learned for us. We started this work 10 years ago, and there was one province with a poverty reduction strategy. In Canada, we now have 9 of 10 provinces in all 3 territories with place-based poverty reduction strategies, and we have over 50 cities that are also engaged in the work. The second area of work, that we have at Tamarack is what we call deepening community, and that's really a way of reconnecting citizens and neighbors together to really envision the change that they want for their communities and engage in deep dialogues, just like the dialogue that the Juneau Suicide Prevention Coalition had last night, to really kind of, let's have conversations about these issues and let's bring in the folks that we need to have around the table to make the change happen. At Tamarack, we really believe in R&D, rip off and duplicate, in our opinion. If you come to our website, you'll see tons of tools and resources, so please feel free to access those tools and resources. Okay, we're going to talk, but I'm not here to talk a lot about Tamarack. I'm here to talk about the collective impact approach to really solving social change. Next slide. So, and this is where we're going to show a video. So the collective impact approach has really been brought forward by a group based out of Boston called FSG Social Impact Consultants. And this group, they wrote a paper in the winter of 2011. What they started to do was look at how communities could address some of these serious social problems. More recently, they've put together this video. So in about 2.7 minutes, you'll learn all about collective impact, and then I'll just build on it with some stories. So if we could show this video, Gus, that would be great.
The number and complexity of challenges facing our world can be overwhelming. When individual organizations attempt to tackle the most daunting problems, success stories are all too rare. Many innovative approaches have been tried, too few have worked. However, when organizations work together under the right conditions, they can accomplish great things. One particularly effective means of collaboration is collective impact. Using the collective impact approach, a number of complex social challenges have been addressed and some remarkable results have been achieved. Youth incarcerations dropped by 45% in just 3 years, with no change in public safety, improving the lives of thousands of youths. 6,000 public housing residents were placed in new jobs during the recession. More than 1,000 acres were restored and over 280 million pounds of pollution voluntarily reduced to conserve and restore a river. Organizations utilizing a collective impact approach do the following: agree to a common goal, agree to track progress in the same way, which allows for continuous improvement, do what each does best while identifying new ways to work together, have consistent communication, and finally, have skilled and dedicated resources to support ongoing efforts. The world's toughest challenges aren't going away. In fact, many experts predict they will continue to grow in both number and complexity. Solving these problems requires a range of expertise from a number of diverse organizations. Collective impact is a proven approach, helping organizations work together to move mountains.
So great. That gives you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. So there are 5 core conditions to collective impact. This idea of having a common agenda, that everybody in the community says, this is a really important issue to our community, and so we're going to come around the community table and really agree to do something about it. They have shared measurement, so they know about the issue, the demographics related to the issue, much as what we've heard over the last couple of days from Patrick and from others. And they also agree to move the needle on the issue. There's mutually reinforcing activities where we leverage the resources of the community to really move this change forward, continuous communications and backbone. So, collective impact is really, for those of us that have been involved in collaborative tables for a long time, and I'm sure that if I were to ask you in the room, many of you would say, yeah, I'm at a collaborative table right now, or, I've been part of one in the recent past. Collective impact is a little bit like collaboration at that next level. It's really saying, we're not here to collaborate around a program or a service, but we are here to collaborate on this bigger change that we're envisioning for our community, for our neighborhood, for our business, for our entity that we're looking at. So it's really about that scale of change. We often think that our collaborative work takes a very kind of linear path, but in fact, most collaboration actually is the bottom of the slides. John Kania, one of the authors or one of the big thinkers behind collective impact, talks about collaboration as being positive or collective impact as being positive and consistent progress at scale. It's a really important phrase, positive and consistent progress at scale. And what he's actually intimating when he talks about that is that he's saying, we as a community say we're going to tackle this issue of suicide. We know, how it's impacting our community currently. We know what the numbers are, which groups are being most impacted by it. And collectively, we're going to focus on a couple of things that we can do together, and we hope to see a net reduction in the number of people that that have engaged in this, or we want to see a healthier and more vibrant community. And so really thinking about positive and consistent progress. Sometimes we sit around collaborative tables, and even though we are engaged in really important work, we don't hold ourselves accountable to this positive and consistent progress. And so collective impact really calls us to do that. Before we dive too deeply into collective impact, though, we want to say, that collaboration happens on a spectrum, and collective impact is a form of collaboration. Around our collaborative tables, we sometimes don't understand how everybody is drawn to this work, and so we think it is really important to think about, okay, so what are we trying to do together around this collaborative table, and what are the different elements of collaboration that we can pay attention to? Everything from competing, so some of us will be around collaborative tables solely because that organization got some funding and we want to find out how they got the funding. So we should acknowledge that competition is part of collaboration, right through to integrating programs and services and really looking at how to do that more effectively. There's two really important things to consider around the collaboration spectrum. When we get to the point where we're coordinating our activities, where we're working more collectively and collaborating and even integrating, we have to look at trust. And how do we more effectively build trust? They say that collaboration grows at the speed of trust, and we know that. And yet, so often around our collaborative work, what we do is we dive into the work and we don't spend time building connections and building relationships and engaging in conversation. And so I think that that's really critical around collaboration. It's even more critical in terms of collective impact because collective impact sits within that red circle. It really sits at that place where, partners around the table are saying, you know what? It's not about my individual organization or program or service, but it's about this change that we're envisioning for our community. And so we need to have trustful relationships with one another in order to be able to achieve that. The other really interesting thing about collective impact is that it doesn't suit every single problem that our communities face. In some cases, our communities face kind of simple problems or even more technical or complicated problems. Collective impact is best suited to complex problems, and a good example of a complex problem is that of raising a child. And for those of you that have multiple children in your families, you know that the strategy that you use to raise your first child is often very different than the strategy that you're going to use to raise your second or your third or your, subsequent children. I have two boys, so, I know that my one son, if I give him $1 at the beginning of the week, at the end of the week he has $5. And if I give my other son $1 at the beginning of the week, in the next 5 minutes, he has no dollars, right? So it's very different strategies that I use with my kids. And that's the kind of issue that an approach like collective impact is best suited to. And over the course of the 2 days that we've spent together, we've really learned about the complexity of trauma. We've learned about the complexity of suicide as well. And it suits this notion of complex issues. And we had a conversation at our table this morning about this very idea. These are characteristics of complex issues. And if you think about, things like poverty or homelessness or trauma, suicide, they fit these characteristics quite significantly. There's, each individual situation is unique. And so while we, on the one hand, want to develop these community-wide strategies, we also have to acknowledge that the strategies have to suit the individual circumstances as well. We also know in dealing with complex problems that there isn't one right or wrong set of solutions. And, we heard from Elaine this morning different stories of individuals and lessons learned from those stories. And I think that was very illustrative of, really taking this approach about how do we learn the lessons as we go, and how do we take the idea that this is a complex problem and our solutions and our strategies have to be really formed in that way. Collective impact, there are 5 kind of questions that you want to ask yourselves if you say, okay, as a community, we want to take this on. We think that collective impact is the right strategy for us. And these 5 questions come out of When Barack Obama was first elected President of the United States, he formed this White House Council on community solutions, and it was really to look at opportunity and priority youth, those youth that might have been incarcerated or didn't graduate from high school or weren't entering the workforce. What could you do as a country to really get to better outcomes for these youth? And so they formed this table, this council, and for those of you that are music trivia folk, John Bon Jovi was a member of the White House Council on Community Solutions. Go figure. Anyways, the White House Council did a lot of looking at how do we deal with this issue of opportunity and priority youth, and they came across collective impact, and they said, that's an interesting approach. These 5 conditions of a common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone. They looked at it, and then they came up with these 5 set of questions, and I think it's really interesting that, they were doing this work, and they saw this framework, and they said it had some real promise for the work that they are doing with opportunity and priority youth. The questions are really important. Do we as a community want to move the needle? Do we want to reduce? And in the case, a little bit of my backstory is that I led a collective impact initiative in the city of Hamilton, which is in Ontario, between Toronto and Niagara Falls, kind of like this, if you know anything about the geography of Canada. And it's a city of about 500,000 people. Heavy manufacturing-based economy, so we had the floor fall out of the manufacturing and lots of poverty in our community. So of the 500,000 people that were living in our community, 96,000 people were living in poverty. Pretty staggering amount of people. So we said, yes, we want to move the needle for those 96,000 people living in our community. And when we started this work, we were tied in Ontario for being a city with the highest degree of poverty in the province of Ontario. Toronto was our partner. We now sit at 16th. So we've significantly, using collective impact, we've significantly dropped the number of people. We've moved people out of the experience of poverty through our collective work. So really saying, yes, we want to deal with this complex issue. We're going to learn as much as we can about the complex issue, but then we're going to take forward strategies in our community to really move the needle and change the circumstances for people in the community. The other things that you want to think about in terms of collective impact is, are we committed to having the voice of people with the lived experience, whatever that lived experience is, to be part of the solution and around the table? And that's a really important commitment as well. In collective impact, while there are 5 conditions, there are 3 preconditions that are also really critical. And last night I came to the gathering that was held here last night to hear about the work that the Juneau Suicide Prevention Coalition had been engaged in. And they talked about talking with key stakeholders in their community here in Juneau and really finding out, what their perceptions were about the issue of trauma and suicide. And, that really fits the first precondition of collective impact, is really to go to those champions in your community and say, we are, people that are motivated to move this issue forward. As influential champions, will you work alongside us with it? Because we know that we are part of the solution, but we need everybody in the community from a whole variety of different perspectives and different sectors to join us in being the whole solution. And, it's really interesting, things that I've learned in this work are that some of those sectors are people from government. But we also know that government only has so many parts of the answer, right? They don't have the whole answer to these complex problems that we're facing in our communities. We have individual citizens, we have the voluntary or community-based organizations, the business community. If you think about some of these serious problems that we're facing, all of those voices need to be represented around the table. So influential champions is critical. Urgency around the issue is a second really important precondition. And urgency really says, what do we know about this problem? How is it impacting our community? And then what are some of those strategies that we can start to embed in our processes that really help us kind of move forward on this challenge or this issue that we're trying to consider? And then finally, the thing that I think is critical as a precondition of collective impact is the idea of adequate resources. So what will it take? What will it take from a human perspective, and what will it take from a financial perspective to really get the community wrapped around the issue and really to begin to move the needle on this, and to really have some important discussions about that? So this slide, for those of you that are sitting in the corners of the room, probably can't read it, but I'm going to go through each of the conditions in a little bit of detail and then give you a story or an example of how a community has used collective impact to really shift some of their thinking and some of their approaches in this work. The first condition, as I mentioned, is this idea of a common agenda. You know, what's fascinating to me is that so often we sit around collaborative tables and we think we all know what we're working towards, and yet we don't. And so a common agenda says, well, if I'm going to deal with the issue of poverty, what's my understanding of that issue? And then if you have 10 or 12 other people sitting around the table with you, what's your understanding and your understanding and your understanding and your relationship with it? So really getting to that sense of, you know, how do we understand this issue? What's the data and the evidence tell us about this issue? What do we know about it related to Juneau, Alaska, or the communities that you're from? You know, how does that experience represent itself? Is it seniors? Is it youth? Is it children? How do we really dive deep into the data? And we spent a lot of time, I think, over the last 2 days doing that. Really critical in a common agenda discussion as well is, what are the values and principles that we are going to bring to this work? And again, we don't spend a lot of time around collaborative tables talking about values and principles. And yet, in collective impact, it's so critical that we talk about values and principles. Do we value everybody's voice around the table? How are we going to act in a way that really empowers and engages people? Do we value this kind of work? What are those things? Are we committed for a longer period of time, a 3 to 5 year commitment, as the previous slide said? Because we know that at minimum, that's what it's going to take to move some of these issues. So this is an example that I've pulled from Australia. This is Suicide Prevention Australia, which is a really interesting example. So you can see, in terms of framing their common agenda, in terms of their work, they really have a vision that they've decided, upon, that they've had lots of conversations around. They have a mission that they've set for themselves, and they've actually identified some core principles in terms of driving their work forward. That's kind of foundational to this work in collective impact and your common agenda work, is to really think about what are those values, those principles, that articulation of the vision that you have for your community, the change that you want to see. We use in this work an approach called theory of change. How many of you have ever engaged in a theory of change process? Yeah, a couple of you. Mostly in work in community, we do logic models, right? And logic models are okay. They're fairly linear. Theory of change is actually an approach where you ask a couple of questions about what's the change we envision together, and you start to look at the relationships between the different pieces. So it fits really well, and it fits very nicely with collective impact approach. This is a visualization for Suicide Prevention Australia. And what you can see, not very well, because when I was trying to take their picture off of the internet, it kind of made itself fuzzy a little bit, but they have these kind of core things that they're trying to move forward. They're looking at community knowledge. They're looking at leadership that they need to have engaged, and they're looking at stakeholder engagement. And they kind of see these as the foundations of the work that they're doing as they move forward towards achieving their vision. We would say in collective impact that having this kind of theory of change, this is their their theory of change. Having this theory of change that is visual is a really critical piece of this work because it allows people to say, okay, if I'm, a service provider in the community, I might be someone that can fit into the leadership area, or I might be someone that can fit into the knowledge transfer area. So it begins to allow people to understand the roles that they can play in a collective impact approach. The second core condition of collective impact is this notion of shared measurement. And I would have to say that here in Juneau and the work that you all are doing, you're ahead of the curve in terms of shared measurement. You certainly understand and have done a lot of surveying and a lot of gathering of information around ACEs, around trauma-informed practices, around suicide, and that's going to set you in really good stead. In other communities that we've worked in, they're further behind. They don't know how to, who to bring in to look at data and how to go through that process. So again, you're ahead of the curve. But what's really important in collective impact is not only having the data or the evidence, but also having processes where you make sense of it, where you have people that can look at it and say, and these are the things that we're learning out of these processes. In Hamilton, I'll tell you a really quick story. So we were doing our poverty reduction initiative, and not too long into the process, we had data from Statistics Canada that said, in Hamilton, we saw a decline in the poverty rate of 6%. And that was such great news to all of us that were trying to do this work. We brought the whole community together, and they were really enthusiastic. And that was also at the same time that the mayor was doing a presentation to the business community, and he really wanted to tell this good news story. For so long in Hamilton, we'd known about poverty, but we never actually were able to kind of see the needle turn in any kind of way. And now we were seeing a decline in 6%. Our approach was to make Hamilton the best place to raise a child, and when we started to make sense of the data, what we saw was a decline in poverty for seniors in our community, not for children. So making sense of the data was really critical, and we spent a bit of time at the roundtable saying, well, what happened for those seniors? What was the experience that they had? And we learned that there was a special program that helped actually a substantial number of seniors actually move out of poverty. That program, the knowledge that we had in that program, we could actually transfer to families with children that were living the experience of poverty, and we then started to see an equal movement of families moving out of poverty. So it's one thing to have the data. The next step is to really use that data in a way that says, what are the programs and services that are the most effective programs and services that will really help us turn the curve on this issue? So here's an example that I'm going to share. It's out of Halton, Ontario. Halton, Ontario is an interesting community. It's a region, actually. There are 4 parts of this region. So there are 2 urban communities, 1 rural community, and 1 very rural community. So their goal, it's the Halton Our Kids Network, their big vision is that all children across these 4 communities thrive. And they have a way of measuring that, and they call that the Halton 7, which is the next box over. The Halton 7 is a mix of demographic information and survey data. And so they will survey kids in grade 6 and in grade 12, and they will do a parent survey. And they do that on a 3-year rotation, because what they want to know is, are the kids in our communities thriving, and how do we know that? So they have their Halton 7, they have 7 indicators that they track on an annual basis, and they report out to the communities. They have different data sources that they're tracking, and then they have programs and services that they deliver. They put all of this information, all of their data online. And so you can be a citizen in Halton Region and you can see how the kids in your neighborhood are doing, right? According to these Halton 7. And this data is public and accessible. They also invite community organizations to publish their data in their data portal as well. This is an example of Halton Region. So you can see, this tells you how kids are doing in grade 3 and the proficiency at grade 3 reading. And the darker the color, the less well the kids are doing. The lighter the color, the better the kids are doing. what they've learned, this has only been the last couple of years, the last 3 or 4 years that they've had this data so accessible and so visual in the community. They're seeing programs and services, the library is one of their partners, and they said, we were going to deliver a reading program in this neighborhood, but now we see that the neighborhood 2 neighborhoods over actually has more needs. So maybe our reading program should be delivered there. So organizations across the region are really starting to look at how to provide their programs and services in a way that have greater impact across their region. The third condition of collective impact is around mutually reinforcing activities. And this, our communities have a wealth of things going on. And I've noticed the last couple of times that I've been in Alaska, I kind of look through your phone books and things like that. You all have tons of clubs and ways that people gather and special events and things like that, far more than I think we even have in Hamilton. And it's really kind of cool to think about all these things. So how do we, as a collective impact approach, if we're focused on an issue, how do we kind of map our community, understand what's going on, and then really focus those programs, those services, those partners in faith communities and in other communities in the education sector, how do we get them all moving in the right direction, swimming up the stream in the right way? So that's the whole idea behind mutually reinforcing activities. And I'm going to show you 2 examples here, and I think that they're kind of illustrative in 2 different kinds of ways. One is the MAP example. So MAP is a mobilizing program. This is from the southern Kenai Peninsula. And then I'm going to show you an example that comes from Erie, Pennsylvania, that's focused on a poverty reduction initiative called Erie Together. So in MAP, it's a mobilized action through planning and partnership. I think it's a process that many communities have used, and this is kind of the framework that goes behind the process. And you can see that it is about really looking at the assets that you have in the community, and then how do you kind of mobilize these assets in a way that works for the greater good of the community. It's a kind of a really nice illustration of the MAP path. And if you go onto the MAP website, you'll see this kind of illustration of taking people through a kind of guided journey to get to the goal of increased community vitality. In Homer and in the southern Kenai Peninsula, they actually took that idea of the MAP path and they started to figure it out based on their journey. And this is their journey, and it starts from the very top, where the hospital in the community said, we are going to engage in a health survey to see, who's doing well in our community and where some of those gaps are in our community. And so they undertook that health survey. And then they started to say, there are some gaps in our community, so we're going to start to form groups to look at early childhood development and some other core areas in our community that we have to pay attention to. And then along their journey, they encountered collective impact. And they said, this is an interesting framework. It's about bringing the whole community into a conversation about these health objectives that we want to achieve in our community. It's not just about a couple of organizations like the hospital and some key leaders having this table discussion, but in fact, it's really looking at the business community and local government and folks that are coming from these institutions, these institutional partners, but it's also bringing citizens to the table. And about a year and a half ago, they hosted a very large conversation that really started to talk about what about collective impact, and could we use this framework to really start to drive change forward in our community. They're continuing to do these annual surveys, so they're saying, we know that in the collective impact approach, we've got to continue to use data and inform our process. And then they landed on this thing about, let's really focus. We know that resilience is a critical factor for our community, but can we focus on family resilience? And so you can see how they are illustrating the path that they've taken as a community to really do this work. Here's the resilience chart that they used, and they said, this is a lot. We could take all of this on, but we're a smaller community. We have some limited resources. Let's really focus where we can get, the most impact for the work that we're going to undertake. And so they said, we're going to really work on the resilience of families here in the southern Kenai Peninsula. And here's the illustration of resilience from a family perspective. And so these are the things that they're now working on. So you can see that the initial project focus was really around early childhood, around the prevention, and around building family resilience. They are now expanding their focus to really look at safer communities, environmental issues, and across community collaboration. And so that's really some of the early work as their journey in this kind of really envisioning a vibrant community is really continuing to go forward. The second example that I want to show you comes from one that we've been following for a while at Tamarack from Erie, Pennsylvania. So Erie, Pennsylvania is a community in Pennsylvania that was one of the hardest hit, again, by manufacturing, the decline of the manufacturing sector. And so they said, you know, we were noted in the newspaper of being the worst community in Pennsylvania, and so we want to change that. So it was led by the United Way, but again, it was a whole bunch of citizens coming together, and through lots of dialogue, they landed on, you know, we want to be the community where everybody can learn, work, and thrive. And so those are the big 3 pillars of the work that they're trying to do, and you can see kind of how they describe each of those 3 pillars. It's interesting how they talk about their work from a collective impact perspective, right? They're not an agency. They're not a program or a service. They are a movement for change across Erie, Pennsylvania. Erie, Pennsylvania, so I'm going to take you through, these are the 3 focus areas, as you can see. They actually call them keystone outcomes. And so they are really focusing, rather than taking on all the things that they could take on from an Erie, Pennsylvania perspective, they're really focusing their work. I'm going to take you through one of their keystone outcomes, the learn one, because I think it's a kind of interesting illustration. So you know how in the map process in the southern Kenai Peninsula, they actually have now 6 priority areas that they're working on, and they keep adding to it. In Erie, they've actually made a different decision. They're going to say, you know, as a community, we're going to really dive deep. We're not going to take on everything, but we're going to take on certain things. So when they looked at the learn priority, they said, you know, here is all the data that we have looked at, and all the research says here's kind of a pathway to success for children, right? That they come into kindergarten ready to learn, that they read proficiently at grade 3, that they get career advice as they go into grade 8 and into high school, that they're successful in high school. It's pretty standard. If any of you know anything about the educational system, these are kind of key markers for kids that are for kids to move through the educational system and become successful adults. What they decided in Erie, Pennsylvania, they could have done things across all of those. They decided to land on one of those. Which one do you think they decided to land on? Sorry? Kindergarten. Oh, interesting. No, not kindergarten. Although a lot of communities would start there. In terms of their keystone outcome, they said, you know, we have limited resources in our community. We are going to focus on 3rd grade reading scores. And why are we going to focus on these? This is why they're going to focus on these. We see a cohort effect. We see that if kids are reading proficiently at grade 3, that in fact grade 2, well, there will be a bit of a cohort there, but we're going to see implications in grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, and all the way up the spectrum. We also see that these children are more likely to be better in science, technology, engineering, and math. So they're going to have better outcomes in the STEM. These kids that are reading proficiently in grade 3, the research tells us that they're also less likely to get involved in the criminal justice system. So they're starting to build the case about, you know, as we go to our community and say, well, yeah, we could be doing lots of things, but we're going to focus on grade 3. This is why we're focusing on grade 3. But then they start to see some other things. Kids that read proficiently at grade 3 also are more likely to begin to think about, you know, college and university and that kind of environment. They're more likely to graduate from high school. They start to think about, you know, they understand how to read medical prescriptions, so they're more compliant and have better health outcomes. And ultimately, this will lead them, they believe, to a healthier and more thriving community, and that they will be able to move on their bigger objective, which is for Erie, Pennsylvania to be a place where all people will learn, work, and thrive. Now you can imagine when they said, we're gonna really focus all our energy on grade 3 reading scores, that the teachers in high school were going, what? You know, what about high school graduation rates? And the kindergarten teachers were saying, well, what about kids being, able to enter into kindergarten effectively? What's been very interesting in terms of the Erie, Pennsylvania experience is that these are the results that they've seen in 3 years' time by really focusing their energy. So on the one hand, you can see the chart where it shows that, the overall US approach is, pretty much 30, 30, 30, but in Erie, Pennsylvania, the kids' outcomes are much better. The kids' outcomes are much better. So it's really taking all of the energy of the community and saying, what do we need to do? How do we get parents engaged in 3rd grade reading? How do we get them to read with the kids? What are the mentors that we need in the schools? What are the supports that we need to provide the school system? How can the business community be at the table? How can individuals come up and help us in this situation? So it's quite a fascinating way of looking at collective impact as an approach, and has some really pretty substantial impact. The 4th condition of collective impact is continuous communications. And it's really interesting to me that that's what this 2 days is all about, is really being able to engage in conversations with one another, to hear presentations, but more to have those hallway conversations about what is it that we're all working on, and then how can we as a community really come together around these kinds of issues. And, we often don't think about the importance and the critical importance of this notion of continuous communications. But there's so much going on in our communities that we think we're communicating to one another, but we're sometimes just talking and nobody's listening. So continuous communications is about that kind of two-way dialogue. Here's an example from a rural community in Ontario, and this is how they really approach this notion of continuous communications. Their agenda, they were working on community vitality, and one of the things that they heard when they landed on that was, we have all these trails in our community. Let's figure out how to build the trails in a way that we can also build our community and our community infrastructure. So they held meetings in the trails. They did this thing where they purchased a series of trail counters, and they started to understand how many people were using the trails on a daily basis to walk from one part of the community to another part of the community. Once they had the data of those trail counters, they saw that, for every person that walked, they used the data from the trail counters, and they matched it with data from Heart and Stroke, and they saw that for every kilometer of trail that was walked, that you actually saved money from a health perspective. And so that made for them a really interesting case that they could take to their municipal government to say, this is why it's important to invest in trails. Now there's another story that's connected to that. So they had these trail counters, and they have a Rotary Club in their community that also had a Christmas display, a Christmas light display in the middle of the community. And the Rotary Club is a fairly small rural community. The Rotary Club was largely made up of more senior gentlemen. And so they were starting to get tired, and they weren't being able to raise as much money to put on this light display on an annual basis. And so they thought, oh man, we're gonna not have this light display. But one of the Rotary guys said, those trail counters, maybe we could borrow those over the Christmas period and check how many people actually come to this light display. Well, what they found was that 100,000 people came to see this light display over the Christmas period by using the trail counters. The next year, when the Rotary gentlemen went out to buy advertising or to encourage their business partners to, invest in advertising, they were far more successful because they had the evidence that said, people come out to this. The Rotary guys were kind of like, man, we didn't realize how popular this display actually was. And so it gave them way more energy. So thinking about how do we use the data? How do we use the evidence in a way that we can really communicate both the seriousness seriousness of the issue and the challenge that we're facing, but also some of the successes that we're achieving along the path that we're engaged in. The final big idea behind collective impact is an idea of backbone infrastructure. And so this is really saying, you know, that in order for us to move the needle on these big social issues, we need to invest in people to take the challenge on and to guide the challenge forward. And so in some cases, backbone infrastructure is a small staff team and a leadership team that will really pay attention to this issue and really move it forward. So it is different than collaboration. It really says, how do we hold this collectively together and move it forward? These are the 6 things that a backbone, what backbone infrastructure usually takes on. They move the policy agenda forward. They look for funding availability. They mobilize resources to really get the work done. If you've ever built a house and you have a construction manager, it's really kind of the role of the construction manager. This is another Alaska example, and just a kind of an idea of a very beginning stage of a collective impact initiative. And you can see who they've brought around the table to really help form their backbone. That they've brought a combination of funders, of government, and also of community organizations to move this forward. And I think that that's a really healthy approach to considering a backbone. What have we learned about backbones since the articles were appeared in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in the winter of 2011, and since we've seen collective impact kind of evolve over Canada and the US, we've seen that this investment in a small core team that really pays attention to the collective impact work, this investment pays incredible dividends going forward. So, my final things that I'm going to leave you with before lunch actually we're still an hour away from lunch, before the workshops and then before lunch, is this notion that it takes a different kind of leadership to really move this work forward. And so, you know, sometimes when the issues are really serious and really challenging to us, we look to the other and we say, it's your problem, right? You know, you have the solutions, I don't have the solutions, or it's too hard for me to take it on. Collective impact really says that we are all both part of the problem, whatever that problem is, so that we all need to also be part of the solution. So it really calls upon us to think differently, to act differently, and to look for different kinds of solutions. And here are just some of the things to consider in terms of your own approach, or your own organization's approach, or your own approach as a leader in your community. It's not about buying in. I'm not buying into this issue. I, in fact, need to be part of the solution of this issue. And all of you here over the course of the last 2 days, you've actually entered into that notion of ownership, right? That I actually do play a role in trying to get us to this different kind of solution that we envision for Juneau, or that we envision for Alaska. And so how can we think about the programs and services and the way that we're engaged in this community in a different kind of way, that we are owning this idea of a better Juneau, or that we're owning this idea of a better Alaska, where everyone's involved and everyone's engaged and everyone's getting the support and the solutions that they require. The second idea is really not only this idea that we need these programs and services in our community, but we've also got to look at what are those programs and services doing to address some of the systemic challenges that our communities face, but also where are those programs and services providing barriers? Because sometimes programs and services are barriers. And we know this a lot in Canada if we look at our poverty reduction work. You know, in Ontario, if you're a person that is living the experience of poverty and you are on what we call social assistance, there are 900 different rules that you have to navigate, and lots of different systems that you have to navigate, right? And so that's not a very helpful process, you know, for our individuals in our communities. They're so busy navigating those 900 rules that they are not engaging in our communities in a way that is really working towards the health and wealth and prosperity of all of our communities. So we have to look at a poverty reduction strategy has to begin to uncover those barriers and really have serious conversations about how do we change those 900 rules? How do we make these communities better and vibrant places? And, that sometimes is about looking outward into the community, but it sometimes is also about looking inward to yourself and saying, what are the decisions, what are the ideas that I have? And we heard that from Elaine, right? What are the things, what are the different ways that we can all act that can be, different, that can provide a different kind of experience for the individuals that we engage with in our communities? This is a really interesting mindset. So sometimes we will form a collaboration and we will bring all of the content experts to the table, right? Because we think, oh, we really need those content experts. And you do. You need people who know a lot about the issue, who can bring some of the data, but you also need context. You also need those individuals who say, this is my personal experience, or this is what I hope for my community. And so a guy that I work with who has done this work for a long time in the United States, Jay Connor, says, any collaborative table should be made up of 50% content experts and 50% context experts. And that's where the business community, that's where people with the lived experience, that's the expertise that they bring, that they're not as knowledgeable about the specificity of the program, but they are knowledgeable about how that is impacting them as individuals and them as a community. And so it's really about bringing both of those elements to your tables, particularly in collective impact work. And then this is a little bit of a challenge, right? Because, often we're drawn to this work because we are an influential champion or we have a sphere of influence, but it isn't about us at the end of the day. It's about the problem. It's about the challenge that we're trying to move the needle on. And so how do we have this notion of shared leadership? How do we think about it not as, oh, my organization is really going to get a lot of promotion because I'm sitting at this table, but no, it is the issue at the end of the day that we're trying to move the needle on. And, I was saying to my table this morning that there's that famous Sufi wisdom that's out there, right? That I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, even if you don't know that it's Sufi wisdom, but it's they know that they've been successful when they said we did it ourselves, right? Which is really that bit of the irony in this, is that this is about the collective. This is about what we're envisioning together. So, what are the things that we've learned about how to do this work? We think that collective impact, around complex issues is a powerful way of doing this work. Pretty simple, 5 conditions, common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone infrastructure. We think it's powerful, but it requires patience. It really does require, these issues that collective impact is trying to address, whether it's, around education, around community vitality, around suicide, around poverty, around homelessness. They've taken a long time to get to where they are. They're not ones that we're going to solve easily, but we're seeing incredible movement forward on them. So it takes patient human and financial capital. We also know that the conditions are simple, but how they will play out in Juneau, Alaska, or in Homer, Alaska, or in Anchorage, Alaska, or Fairbanks is going to look different because the people around those tables are different. The complexity of the problem is different. The way it expresses itself is different. And so what you need is to look at the other examples, but then say, okay, so what will it take for us to do this in Juneau? What are the capacities? Who are the people we need to draw to the table? How can we really get this work done in a way that, is inclusive and does bring those that variety of voices? How do we get to that idea of collective ownership? So that's all I'm going to tell you about collective impact. I think the final things that I just want to leave with you, these are just some links to other resources, is that I hope that what I've been able to do is to provide you with kind of the broad idea behind how to use this framework to really drive your change forward. The challenge is now what, right? So now what can you do as a community? How can you really embed this into your work? So thank you.